Holy, 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 merciful and mighty, God in three persons, blessed Trinity.
Yeah, you just go back to the original link and put in another name. Yeah, so that's the only bad thing is if you fail it, you can literally just go take it again and just put your name in again. So well, no, I'll see that there's two. I'll know you failed it the first time. That's the only thing it really does. It doesn't stop you from taking it. I think I can set a limit. But once you take it, once you know the answers are, it tells you what you got wrong. Yeah, exactly. Take it as Ben Franklin. We'll hope there's no cheater pumpkin eaters.
Our song shall rise to thee. Holy, 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 merciful and mighty, God in three persons, blessed Trinity.
Well, it's 5:06. We have to start.
Holy, 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 all the saints adore thee.
Well, good evening, everyone. Feels a little odd because everybody's over there. Feels like I should move the podium to the middle of the classroom. But we got a few folks out tonight. I know there's something going on next week with the guys at Set Free, so maybe they're just preparing. But I know we have some people online, so I definitely want to keep us on time, and we have at least an hour and a half of material to get through tonight, so I want to keep us on task. First things first, I know we had a little comment or a little conversation about this prior to class, but if you have not taken the class pop quiz, then I need to get with you after class and get your email address to make sure you're registered. I know like you guys are new. I don't know if you've registered. Did you register with the online class?
I tried to, but I don't think it...
Had some trouble with it? Okay, it might be on my end because if you try to register, if it doesn't let you go all the way, sometimes I have to go in and approve you. So I'll go in and make sure that's done. And that way you'll get the link to the pop quiz. This is now going to be our method for our final. It is going to be... you're probably going to get at least one more pop quiz before the end of the semester. We did this one for classes 1 and 2. We'll probably do another one for classes 4 and 5. And then the final will be the final exam. And the great thing about it is you get your score immediately because the computer grades it for you. But I did want to make a mention because it was asked of me prior to class, well, what happens if somebody spells a word wrong? The computer will give you grace if there's a spelling error up to a certain point, like we talked about the word Sproul. If you spelled Sproul instead of S-P-R-O-U-L, like it is Dr. Sproul's name, if you spelled it S-P-R-O-L-L, the computer would probably allow that because it has a grace point on that. But also, if I look at everybody's exam that comes in. I've looked at all. There's a whole list of them that have come in so far. I look at them, and if I go in and see that you missed something, I can change the grade right there. If it's just a spelling error or something. Now, if it's you can't say, like you spelled like M-A-C-A-R-T-H-U-R and it was supposed to be Sproul because that spelled MacArthur. Well, I meant to spell it. Yeah, that's not how that works. You got to be at least honest. And that is another thing. By doing it this way, there is going to have to be some. It solves some problems, but it adds others. The problem that it solves is that it allows you to get graded quickly. You get your information back right away. You know how you did. But the problem is there is the possibility of taking the exam again on this program. I'm not sure how I can eliminate that, but ultimately I can see it. So if you take the test more than once, I saw that you take the test more than once, and if you got a 40 the first time and got a 90 the second time, then it's because you should have got 100 the second time, because the first time you go through it gives you the answers. So good evening. Good evening. So very quickly, let's just go over the pop quiz. I have it in my hand, and it does allow me to have a hard version. So at the end of class, if you are in class, if you want your final on paper, I will print it for you. That's something I can do. But I still want you to go in and put your answers in the computer, because it makes the grading for me easier. But if you just want something to look at, something to put in your fingers and have, I don't mind printing a copy. The final is probably going to be between 50 and 75 questions. So it'll be a couple pages like this. So very quickly, the 4 steps of the revelatory process include all except for the following: inspiration, translation, customization, and canonization. Which one does not belong? Customization. It's not. We've talked about the 4 steps, and that is not one of them. Number 2, inspiration refers specifically to the writer or the writings. The writings. Very good. Inspiration applies to the manuscript copies or the autographs. Autographs does not apply, in a biblical sense, does not apply to the copies. The Bible was written over a period of 250 years, 5,000 years, 1,500 years, or 2,000 years. What was the answer? 1,500 years. That's right. The majority of the Bible was written in Aramaic, Greek, Latin, or Hebrew. Hebrew, yes. We know for certain who wrote every book of the Bible. True or false? False, that's right. We don't know who wrote every single book of the Bible. Hebrews is a good example, but there are some other Old Testament books that we take good guesses, but we are not for certain who wrote them. In regard to the canon, who said we have an uninspired list of inspired books? R.C. Sproul. R.C. Sproul. Now, Miss Jackie pointed out this next question. Actually, it's 2 questions later, had a different answer in the book. So I want to mention most of what is on this pop quiz is what I said in class. So if there's ever a question between what I say and what's in the book, if you know I said it in class, then probably that's going to be the answer, because I'm the one writing the test. However, much of the final will come directly out of the book. So just keep that in mind. And like I said, if she had a very good reason for her answer, I would go in and change her grade because her reason for her answer made sense. All right, so number 8, what do we call the canon which is established what do we call the canon which is established at the time an inspired writing is completed? This was the one that most people got wrong.
Did you say the question?
What do we call the canon which is established at the time an inspired writing is completed? The functional canon, the exclusive canon, the closed canon, or the ontological canon? It was ontological. A lot of people put the exclusive canon because of the way I wrote that question, and I'm going to take some of the burden on that one, because it does sound like what I'm saying is when it was completed. That's not what I meant. I meant when a book is written, it becomes part of the ontological canon. It was just poorly worded on my part. And this, again, I'm learning too. I'm learning how to make this make sense. And I'm not ever going to penalize you for my lack of communication. Number 9, the canon is determined by God and is what? By His people. Discovered. And it gets the 2 Ds. Determined by God, discovered by His people. However, in the book it says it was accepted by His people. And now that I know that's in the book, I can go back and change that as an optional answer. I can make that so it could be one or the other. It's not just a matter of spelling. I can put in optional answers. It's a really cool testing software. So I'm learning a lot. Spent a lot of time this week playing with it, making up fake tests. Sorry. It's just, so what do you do for fun? I make up fake tests. That's what I do. Last but not least, the canon is not an object of revelation. It is a artifact of revelation. Now that one was a giveaway because I used I actually put it is an blank of revelation, and there's only one that started with a vowel. And because the an begins a word that has a vowel, so that one was sort of that was, I looked at it afterwards and I was like, well, I'm not going to change it. We'll see who actually gets it. But that one was sort of a giveaway. All right, so I do have a question by show of hands. How many of you took the test on your phone? How many of you took it on a computer? About half and half. I'm only curious because that is one neat thing. Is like I can pull it up and I can see everybody's scores on my phone. I can like do it on the go, and I can make changes or do whatever. So it's really a neat software. I'm not trying to waste our time. This is new to me. This is, as the class grows, we got a new website, we got a new testing thing. All these things are really, really helpful, and I'm excited. And I'm excited that it's going to help get more people involved. All right, so we move on tonight to class 3, and we're going to begin tonight to talk about the subject of transmission. And as I said, transmission is going to take 3 classes. We've looked first at the subject of inspiration. That was class 1. We've looked second at the subject of canonization. First, God gives the scriptures. That's inspiration. Second, church recognizes the scripture. That's canonization. So that's the process of how we got the Bible in the most basic sense. God gave it, church recognized it. That's the most basic answer to the question of how we got the Bible. But now we come to the question that more, I would say, when people say, how did we get the Bible, this is more what they mean. Okay, if we believe God gave the Bible to Moses, for instance, and Moses wrote it, and the people recognized that God had given it through Moses because people recognize Moses as a prophet. Okay, well, how does it get from Moses to me? Right? And therefore, this third subject becomes really the vast majority of our study. The transmission from how it went from the hands of the original writer to the hands of us today. And so we have 3 classes. We're going to look at Old Testament transmission tonight. We're going to look at New Testament transmission next week. And then on week 3, which is actually week 5 of the class, we are going to look at textual variation. So textual variation. Because as we will see tonight and next week, even though we have a very vast body of manuscripts in our history, no 2 manuscripts is exactly alike. And the differences between the manuscripts are called variations. This morning, a good example happened in church. As I was preaching in Colossians, I was in Colossians chapter 3 and verse 6 or 7, I forget which one it was, where it says that because of these, the wrath of God is coming on, or the wrath of God is coming. And the ESV stops there. Because of these, the wrath of God is coming, period. Well, the King James says, because of these, the wrath of God is coming on the children or the sons of disobedience. There's an entire section that is not in the ESV that is in the King James Version. And so the question is, why is there a sentence of more than 5 words, on the sons of disobedience, 6 or 7 words? We have an entire section that's not in one, but it is in the other. And that's known as a textual variation. And in class 7, which two classes from now, we're going to discuss what that is, how those have entered into the textual tradition, and what can we do about them. Transmission, which is our subject starting tonight, is essentially about the practice of copying and passing down the Scripture. Copying and passing down the Scripture. So when you talk about transmission, you're talking primarily about copying. I've said this in previous classes, but I want to be very clear that we understand this. We no longer possess any of the autographs, meaning we cannot go and put our hands on what Moses wrote in the sense of the whatever medium he wrote on. And we don't even know the answer to that. We don't know exactly what he wrote on, but we can't go and say, here's the thing that Moses wrote on, the medium. Neither can we do that for any of the letters of Paul. Neither can we do that for any of the Gospels. There simply does not exist any autographs that we are able to go and hold in our hands. They have been lost to time, and that makes people sometimes very uncomfortable, because what that means is we are dependent upon copies. I mean, it would be great if there was a storehouse somewhere in Israel where you could just go and unroll what Moses wrote. And if you could do that, there would be no textual variation, because you'd be able to fix whatever variants are in the manuscripts, because you'd be able to go to the original and say, here's this, and there it is. But we no longer possess the autographs at all. So tonight, our outline is this. We're going to look at the Hebrew Old Testament manuscript tradition. We are going to discuss the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls and how that plays into the history of the Hebrew text. And then we are going to discuss the ancient versions, which also bear witness to the historicity of the Hebrew text. And so in your outline, in your syllabus, it actually goes Hebrew manuscript tradition, ancient versions, then the Dead Sea Scrolls, but we're going to put the Dead Sea Scrolls in the middle because of the way I've developed tonight's lesson. I think it will make more sense. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the subject of copying. When we think of the word copy, we almost always, in our mind, think of a photocopy. If I say, I want to make 40 copies of today's bulletin, I can walk into the church office, I can go to the Xerox machine, I can put the paper down on the Xerox machine, hit 40, and I get 40 copies that are exactly like the original because they are a photocopy. And by just simple little trivia question, when was the photocopier invented? Not 65. I'll tell you this, if this is helpful to anyone other than me, it was also the same year Superman came out. No, 1938. 1938, Jerry Siegel and Joel Shuster wrote the first Superman comic book. So that was 1938. Also, what happened in 1938 was Chester Carlson invented a revolutionary device in printing, and it was called the photocopier. So 1938, we haven't even had this device in our world for a century. We haven't even made it to a century of photocopies. So when we talk about copying and transmission, we're not talking about photocopying. And you might say, well, I knew that. But yeah, but sometimes I think people get really upset about textual variation and they forget we're dealing with handwritten manuscripts. We are not dealing with photocopies. Now, let's go back into history a little bit further. If 1938 was the first time the printing or the copier was invented, when was the printing press invented? It was actually the earlier in the 1400s, 1436 by Gutenberg. So 1436 takes us back a little ways. but still only about 500 years, right? So what we have with Gutenberg's printing press is we have the revolution in technology of movable type, where they're able to take and produce a movable type document, use that to imprint onto a medium, paper for instance. They're able to imprint on that, and then they can take that paper off, put another paper down, and print again, and have essentially the same, right? Even though there may be a smudge in the ink, or there may be a letter that's left off because it didn't press hard enough or something like that. Essentially, you get an exact copy. So photocopies only been around for less than 100 years, but printed copies in the Western world has been around for about 500 years. The vast majority of the manuscripts that we discuss in this class will all precede this point, because what really matters to us is not the printed texts that came after Gutenberg, but the handwritten texts that were the basis for those printed texts. Right? Because the printed texts were printed having been either copied from or translated from handwritten texts, which go much further back into history. Here's a quote. You don't have to write this down, but I do want you to put this in your mind. For the vast majority of human history, the only way for a man to have a copy of a written text was to copy it by hand or to pay a scribe to copy it by hand. Because we're talking about before Gutenberg. Now, I do admit, and I think I said this in a previous class, the Chinese have had mechanical printing prior to the Western world, all the way back to the 9th century. But for this particular usage, we're talking primarily of the Western world, the translation and copying of the Bible. It really doesn't apply to us until the 1400s. But you can go all the way back into the 9th century with China for that type of mechanical type. And that's something that, like I said, doesn't really apply to us in a meaningful way, because it wasn't here, wasn't being used by the Western world, but it did exist. In case somebody says, "Well, it existed." Yes, it existed, but it wasn't being used to print Bibles. Let's just put it that way. And just to add a thought to that, what was the first thing that Gutenberg printed? A Bible, right? I've told this story before. I remember Mike. Last time I told this story, you sent me a picture because you went home and watched the movie. But the movie is called The Day After Tomorrow. It's about a tremendous weather storm that comes and freezes a bunch of people. A lot of people die. It's like a disaster movie. Well, in the movie, there's an atheist, and he's holding a Bible. And the guy says, "You're holding that Bible pretty tight for an atheist," or whatever. And he says, "I'm holding it because this Bible represents a revolution in history." He was holding a Gutenberg Bible. He was holding one of the first Bibles ever produced by a mechanical moving type. And he said this Bible, to him, it wasn't about religion. It was about a revolution. And I mean, think about the Renaissance. What was one of the things that brought about the ability for the Renaissance to happen? It was the concept of mass-produced typed material, which didn't exist in the Western world prior to that. So all of these things they matter in regard to how we are able to consider what happened in history. So looking back again, prior to Gutenberg, we're looking at handwritten manuscripts. And for the vast majority of history, all the way back to the time of Moses, it's been handwritten text. So, in your textbook, the textbook chooses to, for some reason, to go through the New Testament. Yes, sir. Hand.
No, just as a matter of thought, there's a leaf of the Gutenberg Bible, so front and back.
Yeah.
They sell for anywhere from $40,000 to $80,000
For one page.
for one leaf. A page is one side of a leaf, so
Oh.
so
Sure, I got you. Wow. Everybody want to pool our money? That's amazing. Yeah. So that guy holding it, he's holding quite a bit of money too. So in your book, Dr. Lightfoot does something interesting. He starts with New Testament transmission. So if you are reading the book front to back like I did, if you're going through it, you're going to find that it seems out of order for the class. And it does, because I'm taking this in order of the books, starting with the Old Testament, then the New Testament. He starts with the New Testament, and there's the reason for it, I believe, is that the transmission of the New Testament is actually vastly different than the transmission of the Old Testament. We're going to learn about this next week. The transmission of the New Testament was copied by various people of all kinds of backgrounds, and it was distributed widely over a very short amount of time. The exact opposite is true for the Old Testament. The Old Testament is transmitted, copied with very specific standards by a very limited amount of people and kept within that community of people over a long period of time. So it's like two different situations. New Testament is copied by a lot of people over a wide area and spread out over a large space. The Old Testament is opposite, absolutely opposite in every way. And so why that matters, I think, for Dr. Lightfoot in the book is he wants to show you how textual variation works, and that happens a lot more in the New Testament because the New Testament has so many different hands, so many different people touching it, feeling it, sending it, copying it. And the early Christians were not professional scribes. So we see scribal errors in New Testament writings that does not exist in Old Testament writings because, quite frankly, Old Testament writings was done at a very specific standard that the New Testament did not have. And so I think he wants to introduce the concept of textual variation and everything in the New Testament. So I think I get his reasoning. But for us, it's different. For us, I'm taking this, like I said, inspiration, canonization, transmission, and the first thing that we got to think about transmission is the transmission of the Old Testament. So, we have a much different transmissional history between the Old Testament and the New Testament. I'll give you, here's the thought. Old Testament, New Testament. New Testament, probably written, the first book of the New Testament. I'm going to go later than I normally do. I'm going to say 49 is maybe the first book. I usually go around 45, but 49 is the latest. And I'll push it out to as far as 90, and that's about as late as you're going to get, even though I think it's more like 45 to 70, but a lot of people disagree. So I'm giving a little bit of a generous berth here. All right, so that is a period of 41 years. Yeah, so 41 years of time. The very first extant copy, meaning the very first manuscript copy that we possess, that we can actually go and touch, is not a full manuscript, but it is a fraction of a manuscript, and we're going to talk about this more next week, and it dates into the 2nd century, which puts it somewhere between 100 and 200, probably closer to the 100. All right, it is a section of the Gospel of John. We'll talk about it's in your books, and I'll show pictures of it next week. So what we have here is a small writing time, and we have a relatively short time between the last book that's written and the first copy that we possess. All right, so if you say this, if it's one, let's just put a number. Let's put 110, because some do date it all the way as early as 110. That means it is within 20 years of the death of the last apostle, the writing of. If Revelation is written that far out, which I don't think it is, but let's just say it is, that puts it within 20 years of the writing of the last book. This is hugely important when we start thinking of things like how much time has elapsed, how much corruption and things can be included in all these questions that atheists always ask about corruption and time and what things are added, subtracted, and all those things. So this is the New Testament. Old Testament is quite different. Because the last book of the Old Testament is written around 400 BC. First book of the Old Testament, probably around 1450-ish. All right, ish, because that's the Moses wrote during the time of the Exodus. So this is a 1,000-year period, right? A 1,000-year period versus 40 years. We've got a 1,000-year period. And we're talking about 400 BC. So 400 BC means before Christ, right? So we'll put Christ here. And we live way over here. We live at 2023 AD, which means in the year of our Lord, right? Where at on that scale do you think we have the oldest Hebrew manuscript? Oh, let me back up. I'll ask it a different way. Prior to 1948, what was our oldest Hebrew manuscript? Because 1948, as we'll see in a little while, changed the entire game. But prior to 1948, when do you think the earliest Hebrew manuscript that we had?
The copy?
Yeah, the earliest copies that we had. The earliest copies, yeah.
Masoretic text?
It is a Masoretic text, but when is the Masoretic text dated to? Approximately. 9th century. Not this way, that way. So the earliest Hebrew manuscript that we possess prior to 1948 was in the 900s. Which means from the time the last book was written, 400, to the time that we have the earliest manuscript was a period of 1,300 years. We're no longer dealing with decades anymore. We're now dealing with millennia, right? We're dealing with over 1,000 years from the last writings to the earliest, right? That's a big difference, right? And a lot of people would say, wow, there's no way it could have stayed perfectly intact over that period of time. Boy, it's got to have all kinds of, it must just be a bag of cats, just all kinds of crazy, because there's no way it stayed perfectly intact for 1,300 years. And that's what you usually hear, the argument. And this is why oftentimes you'll hear people say, oh, the Bible is the best attested work of the ancient world. That actually only applies to the New Testament. The Old Testament does not have the same historical attestation that you can go back almost to the same century as the Old. I don't want you to doubt the Old Testament. Well, I want you to know the facts. You got to know the facts. We'll learn why this is okay in a minute, but I want you to know what the facts are. And the facts are, is up until 1948, the earliest manuscripts we had dated to the 9th century and later, and it's what is referred to as the Masoretic text. When you are reading your chapters this week in the book, the chapters that are assigned in your syllabus, you will see where it talks about the Masoretic text. I'm going to read to you. During the period of 500 to 1000 AD, various Jewish scholars arose dedicated to the preservation of the Old Testament text. This group became known as the Masoretes because of their acknowledged dependence on the authoritative tradition of the text. The authoritative tradition is called the Masorah. Therefore, they became known as the Masoretes, those who are committed to the traditional maintaining of the text. Centered in Tiberias, this school began around AD 500 and continued on for 5 centuries. Their contributions are many. In addition to adding vowel points to the Hebrew text, all Hebrew letters are consonants, they also sought ways and methods to eliminate copying mistakes. So the Masoretes are a group that existed between 500 and 1,000, and their stated purpose was the preservation of the Hebrew text. They did, and you'll notice in the quote and that's a quote directly from your book, by the way. You'll read that when you read from your book. They actually added vowel points to the Hebrew letters because Hebrew is a consonant-only language. Like, for instance, you've heard the name Yahweh, and you've also heard it pronounced Jehovah, right? Has it ever made you wonder why there's two different ways of saying what is technically the same word? Well, that word is actually what we call the tetragrammaton. The tetragrammaton, tetra means four, so it's tetragramma, four-letter. It is a four-letter word, Yod He Vod He, and those four letters we think would most properly be pronounced Yahweh or Yahweh, right? Yod He Vod He. However, there have been debates as to how the vowels are to be pronounced and whether it should have the Yahoo rather than Yaheh, right, or Yahweh, and so you get Yahovah or different words like that. And Jehovah itself is actually derived from the combining of Adonai with Yahweh, because Adonai is another name for God, and so the idea was the combining of the two so that no one misused the tetragrammaton, because the tetragrammaton is the name of God, so we don't misuse the name of God. We'll superimpose the O sound, so Adonai and Yahweh become Jehovah or Yahovah. And obviously the J sound is a Germanic influence because Hebrew and Greek don't have a J sound. Jesus was not Jesus. Please don't be offended. He was Jesus or Yeshua, because they don't have that J sound is a Germanic influence which came later, which is introduced into English. And there's no reason why you can't call Jesus Jesus. There's no reason why you can't use the word Jehovah just because of the J, right? There's nothing wrong with it. It's just understanding a little bit of the history there. So went a little further on that than I meant to, but the importance is when we talk about what the Masoretes did, they included vowel points to try to help with the pronunciation of the words so that the pronunciations would be accurate. And that was one of the things that they added. So, if we say that the Masoretic period is only from 500 to 1,000, the earliest manuscripts we possessed until 1948 were from that period, later in that period, the 900s or better, why then should we trust what we have? Why should we trust what we have? Well, here's a few thoughts. I'm going to give you two specific thoughts as to why we should trust what we have in the manuscript tradition. Number one, the Jewish scribes conscientiously sought perfection in the transmission of the text. According to the Talmud, which is the traditions of the Jewish people that went from 400 BC to 500 AD, so prior to the Masoretic time, there was the Talmudic era. And according to the Talmud, rigid regulations were laid down for making copies of the Old Testament texts. Remember how I said the New Testament text was copied by anyone and everyone as wide a berth as could be given? That was not the case in regard to the Old Testament. Here's just a few, and these are in your book, so you're welcome to, when you're reading, maybe highlight this part because I think it's pretty interesting. But here are a few of the things that the Masoretic, or excuse me, not the Masoretic, but Jewish scribes through history have done in the ensuring of the accuracy of the Old Testament text. Number one, a copyist or a scribe was required to sit in full Jewish dress after having completely bathed. Now, you may say, well, that doesn't have anything to do with the copying of the text. No, but it had to do with the serious nature of what was happening. They didn't do this in the corner somewhere. They did this as a serious business. The copying of the text was serious business, to the point where they took a bath and they put on their Jewish full dress, and they were prepared like a man going to war. They were prepared with their uniform, prepared to, as it were, do battle. And I do want to say this. I'm going to take just a quick second. I do think being a scribe was much like being a man of war. Because even though a man of war puts his physical body to the test every time he goes, a man who sits down to copy something with this level of precision is putting his mind to a strain that is amazing. And so these men were in their uniform, ready to go. Number 2, they were only allowed to use a certain type of ink, which again doesn't seem like it should matter much, but again, nothing was left to chance. Everything was specific. Number 3, there were rules governing the spacing of words. And as we'll see in a moment, that mattered because one of the ways that they tested whether or not a manuscript copy was right is they would actually measure which letters landed in which spots. Because if you missed a letter, it would get everything out and wrong. So that level of precision was there for a purpose. Number 4, no word or letter could be written from memory. It had to be copied one letter at a time, and not like, if you're writing something, you will write a word, and then you'll look back and you'll say, oh, I messed that word up, or I skipped that word. In fact, one of the things we're going to see in class 6 when we talk about textual variation is one of the common textual variants in the New Testament text is something called homoioteliaton. Now, that's a big word, and it simply means similar endings. Because what would happen is you'll come to you'll hold a manuscript and you'll see where a word will have an ending, and then there will be a whole sentence left out, and then there will be another word with the same ending. And what happened was the person was copying, they see the ending of this word, they write the ending, they go back and their eye goes to the ending, but it's not the right word. So they leave out a whole sentence and go on to the next thing. Homoioteliaton, it's hard to say. Homoi means similar, and it just means similar endings. And similar endings, if you've ever copied anything by hand, can mess you up. You can lose a whole line. If you got 2 lines that end with the same word, you leave out a whole line and not realize it. And so that kind of thing was protected in this level of scrutiny because they were counting the letters, they were measuring the spaces, they were being very specific, and obviously it paid off. Lines and letters were Number 5 is lines and letters were methodically counted. That goes with what I was just saying. So they counted lines, they counted letters. Number 6, if a manuscript was found to have one error, it was destroyed. Now, can you imagine being the guy who spent your year copying that manuscript only to find that it had that error and had to be destroyed? I'm going to read a quote directly from your book. This strict set of regulations which govern the early Jewish scribes is a chief factor which guarantees the accurate transmission of the Old Testament text. So it's one of the reasons why we have confidence that what we have is accurate to the original. The second thing, as I said, that was the first, the conscientious work of the scribes. The second thing is the work of the Masoretes, or the Masoretes themselves. And the Masoretes is spelled M-A-S-S-O-R-E-T-E-S. M-A-S-S-O-R-E-T-E-S. The Masoretes themselves took meticulous precautions to avoid copying mistakes and detect scribal errors. And I'll read again from your book. You may not even need to read the book, just read the whole thing to you. But it says this: the Masoretes were textual critics of the first rank. They examined and appraised carefully all the textual materials available to them, and on the basis of their abundant evidence set down in writing the form of the text which had been received at least several centuries before their time. Indeed, their labors were so productive and their contributions so large that our Hebrew text today is often referred to as the Masoretic text. That's why you asked earlier. That's the text based upon their rigid critical scholarship. When I say rigid, maybe it's the wrong word. Their meticulous critical scholarship is what, up until 1948, was what we had to rely on. So, what manuscripts survive? Since we talked about the 900s, what manuscripts survive? And again, all of this is up until 1948. In a moment, we're going to see that 1948 changes the game. We'll talk about that in just a moment. Surviving manuscripts. The Cairo Codex includes the former and latter prophets, and it was written around 895. The Leningrad Codex of the Prophets dates to around 916. The British Library Codex of the Pentateuch around the 10th century, so around 1100 or 900 to 1000, I'm sorry. And the Leningrad Codex, which dates to around 1000, is the oldest known manuscript of the whole Old Testament. So the oldest manuscript of the whole Old Testament that we possess up till 1948. Well, I guess it's still even to this day, because what we're going to see of the Dead Sea Scrolls is that it doesn't contain a whole manuscript. So the oldest manuscript that we possess of the entire Old Testament as we know it dates to the year 1008. 1008. Yes.
Is that the Leningrad you're talking about?
Yes, it's the Leningrad Codex. These are also in your book, by the way. Everything. I mean, I appreciate you taking notes, and I think it's good. But there are some of these things. If you're not getting it all, you will read it when you're doing your study this week. Here's an interesting fact. Prior to 1947, Old Testament versions of the Bible were based on 3 partial and 1 complete manuscript, all of which dated to around the year 1000. So, I just find that incredibly interesting. There's one other codex I forgot to mention. The Aleppo Codex, around 950, was originally a complete Old Testament, but it was damaged. Can you imagine that? It's not like you damaged your current Bible and you go buy another one. One of the only existing Old Testament manuscripts of all time that it still exists, and it gets damaged. It's like, ugh. Okay. All right, so that's a lot to take in. Now, all night I've been whispering hints that there's something important that happens in 1948. In 1948, we have the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And it is a game changer. Read you a quick quote here. The Dead Sea Scrolls discovered in 1948 are extremely important in that they include Hebrew manuscripts of the Old Testament written around 200 to 100 BC. So you know what that means. That means where the oldest we had before 1948 was here, now, because of God's providence, we have manuscripts that push all the way back to 200 to 100 BC. That is a 1,000-year difference. Praise God that we have the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, because it pushes the game back. It changes, as I said, game changer. The Dead Sea Scrolls include one complete book, the book of Isaiah. And it is on display in Israel to this day. There is actually the containers that the Dead Sea Scrolls were found in. I've seen pictures, obviously I've never seen them before, but the containers were shaped similar to this. That's a terrible drawing, but they were these very large pots, and the scrolls were inside of them. Well, there's a place over in the Middle East, I think it's in Israel, but I don't want to be quoted on that, where they built a building that's shaped similar to the pot. It's not exact, but it's sort of, the building is shaped like this, and it has a glass circle that goes all the way around it, and it's got the top like this. But the glass circle is the unrolled Isaiah scroll, and you can literally start at the beginning and walk all the way around it and see the entire the entire Isaiah scroll as it exists. If you look that up, just look up Isaiah scroll Israel. You'll see pictures of it. It's very cool, and gives us again a bit of interesting historical note. Along with the Isaiah scroll, thousands of fragments, which together represent every Old Testament book, were discovered except the book of Esther. It is the only Old Testament book where there was not even a fragment found. And I might put that in your notes with an asterisk, because that may end up on a quiz one day, or maybe even the final. But the only book of the Old Testament which was not discovered in the Dead Sea Scrolls was the book of Esther. Dr. Geisler writes this. He says, with the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, scholars have Hebrew manuscripts 1,000 years earlier than the great Masoretic text manuscripts, enabling them to check on the fidelity of the Hebrew text. The result of comparative studies reveals that there is a word-for-word identity in more than 95% of the cases, and the 5% variation consists mostly of slips of the pen and spelling differences. So we're talking about an almost perfectly preserved Old Testament text, even though the earliest that we possessed prior to 1948 was 1,000 years after Christ. That's amazing historical reality. And when we talk about textual variation in a couple weeks, we'll talk about some of what makes up those 5%. Because there are textual variations, many more in the New Testament than the Old, but we do find textual variation in the Old as well. Here's an interesting fact too, and you'll read this in your book. When the Jewish scribe produced a new manuscript, the old manuscripts were buried so that they could not be misused, and the material they were written on could not be used for anything else. So one of the reasons why we don't have as many Old Testament manuscripts is because there was a belief among the Jewish people that the copies were so perfect you no longer needed the previous generation. You would have the new copy and it was just as good as the previous generation, so there would be a discarding of the previous generation and a maintaining of the new. Now us, we're going, why? Don't do that. Put it in a glad plastic bag and keep it for us, because we want to see it. But for them, they were so confident in the copying process that they felt the new was actually better than the old, because the new was not given to the time of things like the paper beginning to deteriorate, letters beginning to fade, or anything like that. So that's one of the interesting realities of history. F.F. Bruce said this. He said, the new evidence, speaking of the Dead Sea Scrolls, confirms what we had already good reason to believe, that the Jewish scribes of the early Christian centuries copied and recopied the text of the Hebrew Bible with the utmost fidelity. So we have confidence that what we have in our Old Testament is faithfully preserved by Jewish scribes by a very specific system of copying. Now, before we take our break, I have to at least say this, and we are going to take our break. When we come back, we're going to talk about other witnesses to the Old Testament. We're going to talk about other versions. There are actually other versions meaning translations of the Old Testament that also bear witness, that predate the Masoretic text. We're going to talk about them as well. But here's one thing that many people don't like to talk about, and I'm even cautious even to mention this because my goal is not ever to introduce doubt into your mind, but I do want you to know facts because facts are important. The Isaiah scroll is a beautiful example of textual transmission and faithful rendering of the old to the new. But not all of the texts are as perfectly preserved, and there are some questions, the book of Jeremiah being one of them, where there are textual variation which causes a question about the freedom of which the text of Jeremiah has gone through in its transmission. And when you read your book this week, you will read about that. So it'll talk about the books that we have that seem to be the best preserved and the ones that seem to have had the least best. Least best. That's the worst way of saying that. But here's what I'm saying. They're still, even with as good as it was done, even with the level of precision which was used, there still are textual variants that still have to be dealt with, even in the Old Testament. And Jeremiah is one of the ones that has some of those question marks. So again, not trying to introduce doubt, just trying to give you, as Joe Friday always said, just the facts, man. Just the facts, man. All right, take your break, and we'll come back and we'll talk about some other variations. Not variations, but
Our song shall rise to thee.
versions. Thank you.
Holy, 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 merciful and mighty, God in 3 persons, blessed Trinity.
Yes, the first part of the outline, David asked what part of the outline we're on. Hebrew Old Testament manuscript tradition, that was our first part. And that's where I kept saying, wait till 1948, wait till 1948. When I mentioned 1948 was when we switched to talking about the Dead Sea Scrolls. And now I'm going to finish something about the Dead Sea Scrolls, and then we're going to move to the last part, which is our ancient versions. So very quickly, about the Dead Sea Scrolls. I have here a book. I got this from Second and Charlie's, which is a secondhand bookstore, and it's really more of a magazine, but this is an entire history of the Dead Sea Scrolls and some really good information. I wish I could tell you how to get your own copy. Like I said, I didn't buy it from Amazon. I bought it out of a secondhand bookstore. But it's got a really neat part right here, which, remember how I mentioned there are some textual variations? One of the most interesting textual variation is in the Ten Commandments. Because in Exodus, the Ten Commandments talks about the Sabbath, and it says 6 days shall you labor, do all your work, but on the seventh day keep it holy. And it talks about, for in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, right? Well, in Deuteronomy, you get a re-giving of the Ten Commandments, and it doesn't mention the 6 days anymore. In Deuteronomy, it talks about, hold on, it's hard to read like this. Talks about being a slave in the land of Egypt. It says, remember you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand, with an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day. So there's two different explanations for the Sabbath. One is in Exodus, one's in Deuteronomy. Well, in one of the scrolls found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, there is both of those together put into one thing. So it's what we would call a harmonizing. And we do that in our New Testament study when we're studying. Huh?
In both places, it harmonizes
It doesn't say here. It just says the Dead Sea Scrolls were composed since an enterprising scribe tried to straighten out the confusion in the manuscripts known. Oh, it's the Deuteronomy. What it does is adds it into the Deuteronomy portion. So in the Deuteronomy found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, it's got the part from Exodus harmonized into this. And that's one of the things we do see in textual variation a lot, is we see what's called an expansion of the text. And that's where there's something that the text says in one place, but it doesn't say in another place, and so it gets expanded in the other place. This happens a lot in the Gospels, because Jesus will say, for instance, the Lord's Prayer. If you look at the Lord's Prayer in Matthew and the Lord's Prayer in Luke, they're the same in the King James, but they're not the same in modern versions. And people say, well, the modern versions took stuff out. No, it's just through manuscript study we find that Luke didn't have all of the things from the Lord's Prayer, and those things were likely expansions over time through scribal amendation, and we see that happen. So this is just an example of, it happened in the writings of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Another interesting thing, because nobody debates whether or not that should be there. We know it shouldn't. But it was put there because there was an attempt to harmonize by a scribe. Now, who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls? This is something I could do a whole class on just the Dead Sea Scrolls. Who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls? Yeah, we don't know for certain, but we believe it was a group called the Essenes, who lived in Qumran, which is an area around where these scrolls were found. The scrolls were found in a cave near the Dead Sea, and it was around an area called Qumran. And in Qumran, there was a group of Jewish ascetics. During the time prior to Christ and during the time of Christ, there was a group called the Essenes, and the Essenes had a scriptorium. There's actually, you can see the ruins of it, and they've had archaeological drawings of what it probably looked like. There was a pool for them to go and bathe in, the baptismal pool, which they would go through before they would write. It wasn't called a baptismal pool, but it was they would basically be baptized prior to going and writing. There was all these things that you still see today, but they're flattened out because it's been destroyed. It's just what's left is something called a tell. A tell is an archaeological spot where the ground is built up, and you can see what was there, but it's not there anymore. I always joke, I always say, there's a tell over off of 295 if you're driving around 295 heading towards Orange Park and you look off to the right, I think it's over by Pritchard Road, you'll see a giant hill, and it's a landfill. But the reason why it's so high is because they put the trash down and then they bury it with dirt, then they put more trash down, then they bury it with dirt. And so if you were to take a drill and drill into that and go down, 40 or 50 feet and start pulling things out, you would know what year you were in, because you would start pulling things out with dates on them and things that things that existed. You probably find 8-track tapes somewhere in there. You go back a little further, maybe you'll find a record player or something. You know what I'm saying, right? So the same thing exists in the archaeological world, and they will have places that have gotten one civilization built something, and then another civilization built on top of that, then another civilization built on top of that, and they can dig down. And they say, okay, here's when this civilization existed, and this is what it looked like, and here's what was before that, and here's what it looked like. And you can look up Qumran. That is spelled Q-U. It's Q-U-M-R-A-N. Qumran. And you can find pictures of what I'm talking about there with the what's left behind of the scriptorium that existed there. In this book, if you want to look at it before you leave or take a picture or whatever with your phone, here's a picture of some of the Dead Sea Scrolls. This right here is the Isaiah scroll, the one I was talking about. That is what it looks like. That's a Torah scroll. Oh, I'm sorry, that's not the Dead Sea. I'm sorry. So that's an inkwell. There is that's the entrance to Cave 4. That was one of the caves that they were found in. So this all has to do with the Dead Sea Scrolls. You're welcome. If you got this book, again, it's good because if you're like me, you like pictures. You can tell how bad my drawing was because there's the pot. And if you think the pot is like a pot, it's not. It's a pot. It's a man's pot. It's the size. They're big because these scrolls are not little. These scrolls are massive. All right. Okay, so let's finish out today by talking about the ancient versions. I'm going to give you just a few. Some of these are mentioned in your book. And by ancient versions, what I mean is these are not Hebrew. These are essentially translations of the Hebrew, but they still date to earlier than our earliest Hebrew copy, and they therefore bear witness to what the Hebrew said. The first one is the Samaritan Pentateuch. Now, the Pentateuch means the first 5 books of the Bible. The Samaritan Pentateuch dates to around 400 BC. It is a manuscript of the Hebrew text that covers the first 5 books of Moses. It's not in Hebrew. It's the Samaritan Pentateuch.
Excuse me. Is that Samaritan or Samaritan?
Samaritan, like Samaria.
Samaritan.
Yeah. Yeah. Dates to around 400 BC. The Aramaic Targums, and your book talks about what Targum is. The Aramaic Targums, essentially the word Targum just means translation, came into existence after the exile, and we still possess some of those. I don't have a list of dates or anything on that, but just know that those were written after the time of the exile, prior to the time of Christ. So again, these are versions of the Old Testament that predate Christ, and again, therefore have value because of that. Oh, okay. The Syriac Peshitta, which was begun in the middle of the 1st century AD, the Peshitta is in close agreement with the Masoretic text. So it's a Syriac version that dates to the time of Christ, middle of the 1st century. And it, again, bears witness to the reliability of the Masoretic text because they're in very close agreement. And now for the granddaddy. The granddaddy is the Septuagint. The Septuagint is a Greek translation of the Old Testament which existed at least 200 years prior to the time of Christ. The Septuagint stands as an important witness, but it also provides its own set of problems. Because there are times where the Septuagint does not always agree with the Masoretic text. So it introduces textual variation, but it also is a blessing because in most places it agrees and demonstrates the fidelity of the text. One of the things that we can show by virtue of simply showing the use of language in the New Testament is that the New Testament writers often quote from the Old Testament and quote from the Septuagint. In doing so, at least bearing witness to its use among the people of God. I call it the granddaddy because honestly, before the Dead Sea Scrolls, it was the witness that went back that far. I mean, it bore witness to 1,000 years prior to the time of the Masoretic text. And here's the other thing that it does, and here's an interesting little tidbit. Every Christmas, I show the value of the Septuagint. Because every Christmas, somebody will mention disbelieving in the virgin birth. Whether you're watching the Discovery Channel or whether you're watching something, someone will say the virgin birth is not true. And in the Old Testament, the passage which predicts the virgin birth is Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14, which says, "Behold, the virgin will conceive and bear a son, and they will call his name Emmanuel." Well, Isaiah chooses in that text to use the word in Hebrew, Alma. Now, the word Alma can be translated virgin, but it can also be translated maiden. Maiden. Now, or even young woman. Young woman. The more specific word in Hebrew for virgin is the word Bethulah. Isaiah chooses the word Alma and not the word Bethulah, which is the word for virgin. And as a result, some have concluded that Isaiah never intended for anyone to believe that a virgin was going to conceive and bear a son. I don't believe that, but I just want that to sink in for a moment. People say, because Isaiah used the word Alma, he didn't use the word Bethulah, that means Isaiah never intended for us to believe a virgin would conceive. I've told this story before. We had in the 1980s, this church was much different back then. We used to be part of a very liberal denomination. God has moved us out of that. But in the 1980s, when I was a wee lad, this church had a pastor who didn't believe in the virgin birth. He denied the virgin birth of Christ. Probably denied many other things, but that's the thing we found out come Christmas time. Again, when he didn't want to teach on the virgin birth because he didn't believe in it. And if you go back to the RSV, I believe it's the RSV, which is a early 20th century version of the Bible, and you read Isaiah 14, you will see that it doesn't say, "Behold, the virgin will conceive." It translates it as maiden. It translates it as, actually I think it may translate as young woman. You can look that up. Look up Isaiah 7:14. You'll go down, virgin. You look at the different versions, like on Bible Hub, you can see all the different versions. It say virgin, 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 young woman, virgin, virgin. Whichever the one says young woman, I think it's the RSV, that's the one. that caused such an uproar, and rightfully so. Because people said for years this has said virgin, why is it now being translated as maiden or young woman? This is the reason why. Now, does that mean they're right? No. And I'm about to knock it completely out of the park, but this is their reasoning. Their reasoning is that Isaiah's intention was to say a young woman will conceive and bear a child. Here's the fun part. And you can, anytime if anybody ever brings this up, feel free. Use this and knock it out of the park. Because this to me is just the answer, and it's so simple. We have a translation of the Bible that predates the time of Christ. Because what they'll say is the reason why Christians want it to be virgin is because we want it to agree with the New Testament, because the New Testament says a virgin conceived and bore a son. But the Septuagint, dating 200 years approximately prior to Christ, translates this word. And it translates this word as Parthenos. And Parthenos is the Greek word for virgin. So the writers of the Septuagint could not have been influenced by Christian thinking because Christian thinking did not yet exist during the writing of the Septuagint. Therefore, the Septuagint, if it does nothing else, it bears witness to the fact that prior to Christ, it was believed that Isaiah had prophesied that a virgin would conceive and bear a son. So there is value in these other versions. But again, the Hebrew is king because Hebrew is the original language. Just like we're going to see next week, we're going to see that there are other versions of the New Testament. We're going to see like the Coptic and the Ethiopic and other translations which came out very quickly after the New Testament was written, but the Latin Vulgate, which comes out in the 4th century, becomes the book of the Western the Bible of the Western Church for 1,000 years. But yet the Greek stands above the rest because it's the original language, just like in the Old Testament, Hebrew stands above the rest because it is the original language. But we still have value in these other versions. And so when you're reading this week, you'll read about some of these versions and what they teach us, what they show us, and why they matter. All right, so I know that tonight was a lot of information over a very short amount of time. But we have a few minutes left. I'd like to ask, what questions do you have? Yes?
One, it's been something that I've thought about a lot, and a short answer will suffice. But since all the apostles are quoting the Old Testament using the Septuagint, and I hear a lot that even that Jesus used that version. I don't know if that's correct or Jesus and his apostles would use the Septuagint. That was the standard Bible. And the Septuagint has also the Deuterocanon in it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I guess that's one thing that I'm trying to get more information on.
Sure.
Like a comment. Since the apostles give their seal of authority when they're quoting from there,
Mm-hmm.
and yet it has the Deuterocanon, which I don't think are canon for other reasons.
That's a very good question, and I'm going to repeat your question only because someone asked me who watches it online, hey, can you repeat the question of the person? I just want to make sure everybody at home hears what you just asked, because that's a very thoughtful and very quite difficult question, actually. Because the question he's asking is, if the New Testament writers quote the Septuagint, and the Septuagint is by that being given at least a tacit level of authority by quoting it, and the Septuagint includes the deuterocanonical books, why do we not accept the deuterocanonical books? My answer is going to be hopefully not too simplistic, but my answer is simply this. The use of the Septuagint by the New Testament writers is, I think, utilitarian in nature, meaning they are using it because of the necessity of getting the gospel to the Greek-speaking world. It's being used not because not because of its inherent value, but because of its inherent utilitarian usefulness. And I don't think that they are giving it the weight of Scripture in the same way that the Hebrew text is given, but they're using it because it's available to get the gospel to who they're sending the gospel to. In much the same way that if I were, and this is the best example I can come up with again, just a thought, if I were going to be bringing the gospel to the people of China, and I was going to use a Bible, I would have to use whatever Chinese Bible was available to me, even if it's not the best one, or even if it had things in it that I didn't necessarily agree with, or if there were portions of it. So I would have that Chinese Bible, I would use that Chinese Bible to get the message across, but that doesn't mean necessarily that I don't have issues with what's in that Chinese Bible. So that would be my first simplest answer. And to add to that too, we know that the Jewish people as a whole did not accept the Deuterocanonicals as part of the Palestinian canon. We talked about that last week. And the New Testament writers never quote from or cite the Deuterocanonical books in the Septuagint either. So those would be my reasons for saying that even though they made use of it, I still don't think it's given the same weight as the Hebrew text.
Yeah, that's good. If I may, a follow-up.
Sure.
I don't want to take too much
No, it's just that one was hard, so you're going to give me a harder one.
time. Look, I'm just trying to work.
No, please.
So whenever the apostles do quote using the Septuagint, and we have variation between the Septuagint and the Masoretic, given that specific quote, we can conclude that that Septuagint has it right in that quote. Since they're quoting,
I love you. What he just asked is a very difficult question. I'm going to quote. I'll repeat it. He says, when the New Testament writers quote from the Septuagint, if there is a textual variant with the Masoretic text, does their use of that variant demonstrate that that is the accurate reading?
you don't have to answer.
No, I want to answer. I just want you to know that's top tier question. That's a good question because I have an answer, but nobody's going to like it. Huh?
Did it never happen?
No, it did happen.
Okay.
That's the point, is it did happen. And Dr. James White makes a very important point about the fact that it did happen, because in debates with King James Onlyists and things like that, he'll bring this one specific issue up. And he will show that even in textual variation, God's word is preserved. And that's a very difficult thing to understand. That God's word is not internally corrupted even if there's a variation. And that's tough to hear, and it's tough to even understand what's being said with that, because it sounds like a contradiction. But the point is, the New Testament writers quoting from the Septuagint are, and a good example of this, I don't have the text in my mind. Somebody's going to hear this online and freak out that I'm not going to get this right. But there is a place in the New Testament where a quote is made. I talked about this in my Genesis study when I talked through Genesis, because there's a quote about the descendants of Joseph. If you look at the descendants of Joseph, which I think is Genesis 49, the Septuagint does not agree with the Masoretic text. And the New Testament agrees with the Septuagint. What do you do with that? And the answer, some would say, well, we just go with what the New Testament writers, because that's obviously what was inspired, right? Dr. White takes a little different approach. He says it shows that the heart of the truth is still there, even though the numbers change, and it's hard to understand what he's saying. But ultimately, that type of textual variation doesn't eliminate the what's the word I'm looking for? The preservation of the text. That the text is preserved even in the variants, and that's very difficult to get. But like I said, you just asked a top tier question. It's very difficult, because we do have to deal with that, and it's tough. I think there are a few simple answers. One of the ones would just say, if the New Testament uses it, that must be the right answer. That must be it. But then that brings you to the next question. Well, what about when I go back to Genesis? Because Genesis says different than this, and now I'm stuck. Should Genesis be changed? And I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that's where we have to deal with the question, right? Should we go back and change the text in Genesis? Yeah.
Because to your point, I'm reading the Old Testament version that is based on the Septuagint.
Mm-hmm.
It has some troubling things compared to what I've been reading.
Yeah.
So like, while it, like you said, it's a good utilitarian value,
Yeah.
we can't just wholeheartedly just go with that.
No, and I wouldn't say that. I definitely don't say we wholeheartedly go with the Septuagint. I say obviously the Hebrew is king, but that doesn't mean that we don't run into some issues. And the New Testament use of the Old, and this again, how do we know they're using the Septuagint? Things like this is how we know, because they're quoting from a textual variation that exists in the Septuagint. That's how we know that that's what they're using. Now everybody's upset. Thanks. No, I'm just kidding. No, that's a great question.
I was supporting your point. that-
Yeah, it is. The Septuagint is a blessing, but it also introduces issues issues of textual variation that we have to deal with, right? And we have to ask the question, what is its value? And I think the value, as I said, is a utilitarian value. It was used by the apostles to get the gospel to the Greek-speaking world. They didn't reinvent the wheel. They didn't retranslate the Hebrew into Greek. It had already been done. They used what was done to get the gospel into the world. But again, there are times when they cite it, having cited a textual variation, which creates some questions. Very good ones, actually. Anybody else got a question? I don't think anybody's going to beat that one, but anybody else got a good question? All right. Anybody online got a question? Or do they? Okay, good. All right. Well, hopefully that was helpful. We will, next week, we're going to have fun because when we get to the New Testament, it's totally different. So we'll have another set of learning. Let's pray. Father, I thank you for your word. I thank you for your truth. And I do thank you, Lord, that we can trust what the word says. We can trust your method of preserving it, even though we can't always nail down every single bit of how it was done. We know that, Lord, you have ensured that your people have your word. And we trust what it says. In Jesus' name, amen.